Yeah, if you wanted to speak English, don't be afraid. If you have understood what I said before. Otherwise, I am unable to tell the whole story once more in English. I only can tell you that Mr. Sarazzolo has asked the question about the shadow cast by analytical psychology in general. My view is that it casts a tremendous shadow, which you can see if you open your eyes. You can read it everywhere, but one could not construct a real, a valid shadow by the data given, the documentary data given by analytical psychology, because I simply don't know where the great holes are. I always try to fill them, and as far as I have seen them, I have filled them as well as possible. Of course, it is not perfect. I have done it as well as I could. And it is up to the critics to do better. No question. All right, then we go on. Mrs. Heumann fragt, is the animus of a woman whose superior function is thinking in possession of her feelings and producing inferior value judgments, or is her superior thinking due to a developed animus while the eros principle remains unconscious and in the hands of the shadow? You see, when the animus of a woman whose superior function is thinking is in a normal condition, then there is no reason whatever why she shouldn't or couldn't be in possession of her feelings. When her thinking is proper, it will not interfere with feeling values, and so it will not stop a feeling development. On the contrary, it will lead to it. Because when you follow your intellectual development, you soon will come to a place where fate will show you that you can't get through with intellect alone, that you need feeling. You see, you cannot go on with intellectual development and not get into a collision with the feeling values. And your intellectual development would be badly at fault if you would neglect the values. Not that it didn't happen, that is just our trouble. We developed the intellect with no regard to feeling values. And then you simply get stupid, dumb, as intellectual people are who neglect feeling values. Nothing is more stultifying than the absence of feeling values. Now, it is true that when a woman has a superior thinking function, then she probably has developed her thinking through the critique of the animus. That would be necessary. No thinking can be developed under an animus, but because the animus is the contrary of thinking. You see, for instance, I criticize a woman, and then she said, "Oh, I thought," and that means she did not think. And because, you see, when she said, "I thought," she did not think. She was thought by her animus. She had an animus opinion. For instance, I say to her, "Now look here, I dislike when you do this or that." Then she will do it. And then I say, "Now why did you do it?" "Oh, I thought you liked it." That's what the animus does. That goes down into the smallest detail. For instance, you say, "Oh, are you going to the shop? Could you bring me a little box of cigar of that and that kind? But only a little one." Then She brings me a big one. Because I said a little one. And then she said, oh, I thought, you know, just not. Now see, when she has a superior intellect, then she must have gone through a process of cleansing intellect, because animus is absolutely prohibitive. It is just not mind. It is anything else, but just not mind. It's the contrary of a real intellect. But you see, if on the other hand her superior thinking is a superior animus, then her real intellect is inferior. And what she has, or what appears to be an intellect, and is nothing but her animus, then she possesses no intellect. She can be behind the screen, the animus screen, as stupid as you want. And so she is. I shall never forget, I was once at a diplomatic dinner, and my lady I was afflicted with was the sister of a very famous man, and she was apparently the big thing, the big mind, you know, and she had very intellectual circle. On the moment we sat down, for 1.5 hours, she absolutely swamped me with philosophy and God knows what. I had no chance to fit in one single word. Then suddenly she stopped, feeling that now I must be flawed, and said, but I always talk, what are your views with reference to this or that highly abstruse philosophical subjects? I said, you know, I would be very interested to know what you think about these things. But now I have swamped you with my ideas. I said, no, madam, you haven't. You told me what I could read in the Encyclopedia Britannica or anywhere else. I'm not interested in all that stuff. I would like to know what you think. What I think? Oh, well then I should think first. Well, the result was that the next day she called me up and wanted to see me privately for a consultation. She had discovered that she never has thought the slightest thing in the world. That is a superior animus. But everybody swears she's the most intelligent, extraordinarily educated person. She only talks drivel, intellectual drivel. She knows nothing. She has acquired nothing. It's all talk. That is a superior intellect. Now, such an animus, such a sort of quasi-intellect, is most prohibitive with reference to the development of feeling, because it kills the feeling completely. Not only the feeling of her public, but also her own feeling. Her own feeling remains very primitive and helpless, lame, ridiculous, childish, egotistical. Her feeling is simply impossible. And she also is unable to establish a feeling rapport, because your feeling is killed from the start. Because even a woman begins to talk such drivel, a man with a trace of intelligence simply drifts off, he falls asleep. As a matter of fact, I had the greatest trouble not to fall asleep. And the only thing that kept me alive was eating and drinking. Any other question?
Well, Dr. Jung, would you equate this intellect with her thinking function?
Yes, yes.
Or with,
no, with
say,
her
with
thinking
her ego,
function.
the speculative and practical sides of intellection, which would go into ego function?
No, this, you see, the definition of intellect, you find in my psychological types, it is the function of thinking, whatever that is. But only philosophers don't know what thinking is. Psychologists do. Any other question?
Could one say that instead of saying that the superior...
A bit louder, please.
The superior thinking then is not due to a superior animus, but to a redeemed one. Would that be right?
What's the superior intellect?
Yeah.
The real one?
Is due to a redeemed animus.
Not due to a redeemed animus, but the redemption of the animus is due to a better thinking. That woman only, I spoke of, only gets rid of her animus when she begins to think, when she is condescending enough to come down to the fact that she never has thought and she doesn't know what thinking is. Then she begins, and that is the redemption of the animus. The animus is caught in the primitivity. You see, that is the spirit that fell into matter and must be liberated, and that only can be done by real thinking, by the thinking of the individual, not by that demon that consists chiefly of words. That is, of course, the danger of any woman with a good intellect, that she eats the wrong food, that she eats the straw and not the oats, the husks and not the contents. And there are, of course, men who cater to it, men whose whole intellect consists of words, and they use the words as a sort of magic means to twist the mind of the women. You see that in practical cases of fils à papa, where father produces the wrong kind of spirit, and she eats all that and is poisoned for a lifetime. Now, of course, what I said here about the misadventures in the development of a woman is equally valid for the men. There you see the same twisting of the feeling life of a man through the viciousness of the sloth or the lies of the mother. Now there is a question of Mr. Raleigh. I better read it. When we speak of repression, does this imply that the repressed matter at its origin did once arise to a conscious level, in which case the difference between suppression and repression would be one of the present degree of consciousness, or is it possible for repression to function without the repressed matter ever coming up to consciousness? Now this is quite an apt problem, which when I was quite a young man and still a good friend of Professor Freud, I had taken up with him, because the term repression confers the idea that a content which needs a conscious content, otherwise you couldn't speak of it. The content that is conscious is repressed by an action, say a moral action or something like that, equally conscious. But then I had made my association experiments, and I found complexes that never had been conscious, couldn't have been conscious, and they were repressed. So the question arose. The patient never had been conscious of this fact. Yet it showed itself in a repressed state. He has never repressed it. He never knew it. It only can be that something has developed in himself from his unconscious, and he didn't know it, that such a development took place. It is all quite naturally in an unconscious state. Still, it is subliminal. It hasn't reached the surface yet. But it never has been on the surface and has been repressed. I put that question to Freud, and he said, yes, you are quite right. There are such things. But he never made use of it. And later on, I came back to it. And he didn't like it. Because that was a case where the theory of repression was inapplicable. It is awkward, yes, when one has such a nice theory of repression that applies in most cases, and certainly you have a case where it doesn't apply. That is, for explorer, a most lamentable fact that he has built up a nice conception of something, and he has all the legitimations for it, and suddenly discovers that it doesn't apply in every case where it should. Of course one dislikes it, but I always felt a sort of defeat when it happened to me that there is a world perhaps of experiences that don't enter that concept which was meant to catch them. I can well remember the time when I was working over the types. I first thought only of thinking and feeling types. And then, by chance I should say, I discovered that sensation must play a role. Yeah, of course. But the sensation is not thinking and it isn't feeling. So we have three functions, you see. Now, I had to say, we have not two functions. We have extroverts, introverts. Now, that's very nice. And then feeling is extrovert and thinking is introvert. That's absolutely pat, you know. And then along comes that little hell of sensation and overthrows my whole apple cart. Naturally, I hate it. I would have hated it all the more if a young person would have told me, but don't you overlook sensation. Of course, I would have hated it. That's hellishly awkward, you know, because every man who is doing research work is vain with reference to his work. That is you see, it's terribly vain that he has such a nice mistress or something like that, or he's like a nice hat, or he has written a book, and a nice book, you know, and so we cannot go back on it. And if anything happens that shows that it is not so marvelous after all, well, that's hateful. So naturally, I was particularly careful to examine whether sensation is really legitimate to be a function. Nowadays, I should say, it's perfectly ridiculous to make any bones about it. Of course, it's a function. And then, mind you, I didn't know of intuition. That was the worst. Because it is, of course, also the most difficult, because it has really no proper legitimation. It is not rational. It is rational to think, or that means to want to know what a thing is. It is also quite rational to know or to learn what that thing is worth to you. It is also, after all, quite rational to state that a thing exists, which is sensation. And now what? There's nothing beyond it. And so I said, we have three functions. And lo and behold, I had a patient, an intelligent lady, who was she was quite clever in certain ways. but highly neurotic. Once on a day she said to me, "Why don't you speak of intuition?" I said, what do you mean by intuition? That is no function. It was not in my three functions, you see. And what is intuition after all, you see? It's a hunch. There's nothing. How can you define an intuition? Intuition is something that drops into your mind. You're suddenly reminded of something, or you foresee a certain thing which you couldn't possibly foresee. That's most illegitimate, you see. Most illegitimate. How can you know something ahead? And nobody knows something ahead. It is just guesswork. An English professor who wrote a very scientific critique of Rein's ESP. He said, all those preconditions and or that ESP function, that's nothing but guessing. See, and he thought he had said a big word, nothing but guessing. And so I said, then, oh, that's nothing but, well, a lucky guess or so. This is no function. Until I picked up, but you see, it gave me quite a jolt, what that lady said. And then I began to pay attention. And then I began to study what intuition is, and then I discovered how that thing is done. And then I knew, she was an intuitive, of course. And I studied her very carefully, and when I saw a certain expression appearing on her face, I knew now she is intuiting. And that expression was that she had a sort of bland expression. One couldn't make out. She was simply staring at and through. And then I knew, now she's going to say something. And so it was. For instance, when you want to know what I mean by that peculiar look, look at the picture of Goethe by Stieler. There he got the intuitive eye. You see, for instance, I observed that case in all phases. I had at the same time a patient who was, I knew then, he was a sensation type, a very accurate and objective observer of the things as they are. Now, the two became acquainted, and he invited her occasionally for a little ride in a boat on the lake. And there they noticed these divers, these birds on the lake, and they began a game, namely to guess where the diver comes up again, and who is first to see him. And he lost all his bets. He was always ahead of him. So she, that was not aware of reality to an uncanny degree, saw always the bird first coming up. He lost all his bets. Because he did it in a legitimate way, as one observes. You just watch out, you look where the bird might come up. She did nothing of the kind. She didn't observe at all. She had it in her bones. Now explain that. And but I saw it is a function. It does exist, but it is something like ESP, and that is not allowed in decent society. So I'm up against it. That was my first defeat. There the great shadow began, because I admitted the existence of intuition, which is really an obscenity, because it cannot be, it shouldn't be. Somebody that does not observe observes better even than a trained observer, which is a fact. Yeah, I don't know how I got to this. How did I get to this argument about the
I would like to go back to that because it was the question of repression.
Yes.
Suppression or repression, and how one would explain
repression.
How one would explain these contents which had never been conscious and yet were obviously repressed.
Well, you see, when a thing was never conscious, then it cannot be a question of conscious suppression. The repression, as Freud seems to understand it, would be really a suppression, because there is a will to suppress. But you know, he is not quite clear about it. And as far as I remember our talks about it, I always had the impression as if he were meaning something he is not exactly doing, that it sort of happened to him. And that is, of course, the superego, of which there was no question in those days. That didn't exist then. So you see, his concept of repression always had a little bit of something involuntary. It just happened somehow. And one found out that because the father had said so and so, or because you read in the Bible, you don't do it, or it is wrong. So he never took full responsibility for that term, or the factor of repression. For instance, take the censor in the dream, which is the same, you know. The censor happens in the dream, you know, it functions in the dream where one is not properly conscious, and one cannot say that you are the censor. The censor is, and causes that one doesn't dream something obscene or incompatible. I had that discussion too with Dr. Freud personally. I said, I admit, if you dream of a revolver, of a rifle, of a walking stick, of a church spire, this can be a phallic symbol. But when you dream of a real penis, what then? Then the censor hasn't functioned. You see? So the censor is an autonomous figure, a very mystical something. And later on it became obvious that it was the superego. But in those days I knew, I was with Freud, that concept didn't exist. And so his idea of repression remained a bit in the dark. But, you know, when we speak of his theory, then I would rather use the word suppression. That I know this is wrong, therefore it must go. Or, as Nietzsche says, this is what I have done. I cannot have done it. I could not have done such a thing. Finally, memory fades out. That means it is no more. Now you see, that is how repression works. But this is, when you pull it out into the light, then you must say, well, for such and such reasons, I'm quite conscious of. I have taught the Decalogue, I had my education, and for those reasons, I exclude this thing. I let it drop over the table, or I stamp my foot upon it. It would be then a conscious affair. But over against these repressions, there are things that are definitely not repressed, because they are utterly unconscious. They begin to germinate in the unconscious. They reach a certain level in the unconscious, and suddenly they pop up. There it is. They never have been repressed because one didn't know them. If you assume that the repression works unconsciously, then you would be confronted with the fact that a thing you don't know is suppressed by a thing of which you know nothing. Now, how is that possible? Because when something is in the unconscious, you're just not conscious of it. And so you cannot say something is happening there because you don't know. So that the hypothesis that repression works by itself, as it were, that the contents are unknown, the repression, the fact is unknown. You only assume that there is such a thing. You know, as a matter of fact, you know nothing. You know neither the repressor nor the repressed. So we must dismiss that possibility. Now, is there any question? Gehen wir zur nächsten Frage. Und das ist die Frage von Herrn Hillman. Well, this question has to do with the importance of the body as the basis of the psychic process. The question, if I understand properly, seems to be whether the body is the apt vessel or is a good vessel for the mental development or the mental process. The question that Mr. Hillman puts in the end, what can we do towards strengthening and refining the vessel? How can we bring ourselves and our patients closer to an incarnation of the process and the resurrection of the flesh? I would say, according to my bias, and to a resurrection of the spirit. Now, I should be grateful to Mr. Hillman if he kindly would explain a little bit or comment on his question so that I see more clearly what it is about.
I think I said it in the first paragraph that after a certain stage in the process is arrived at where there's dynamic content or the spirit is shows itself, a lot depends on the body as the vessel for holding this. And often
yes, there you say, excuse me when I interrupt you, as the analysis proceeds so that a certain access to the spirit has been made possible and dynamic contents have begun to move, the whole trick of the work seems to depend upon the vessel. Without it being right, the process never becomes real, or it just goes up in the air, or it can turn and destroy. All this is perfectly true, but think, for instance, of people who are in a serious physical predicament, that means gravely ill, perhaps even dying, where the body is really seriously in question. Yet, it is the only moment in the life of that fellow where some spiritual or psychical process is possible at all. And his body is not at all in a favorable condition. Quite on the contrary. See, certain people need, for instance, physiological illness in order to be able to understand something of psychology. Only when they are ill or in pain, then they are apt to understand some psychological connection or a psychological significance. As long as they are normal, they are as dull as stones. It's simply nothing will register. Sure enough, one always says in corpore sano mens sana, that the mind is sound in a sound body. Yes, that is a general truth. But don't forget the psychological device. Nothing is true And even that is not quite true. So you see, one can have a perfectly splendid mental or spiritual state even against the body. On the contrary, the one who is wounded can heal the wound. And the one who is handicapped by his body can develop arts and crafts or ideas which other people cannot do. So the general banal truth, which you can read in Reader's Digest, for instance, is that you must have a sane body and then everything is all right. Sure enough, that is generally true. But this sentence is so hellishly banal that it must be true when you turn it around. Too. Namely, you don't need a sane body in order to be mentally sane or advanced even. On the contrary. But there is also an attitude, you know, of unsoundness, namely neglecting the body, thinking derogatory things about the body. One shouldn't do such foolish things. One should give everything the due value. When you see an ass, a donkey, and you think, this is now this ass, this terribly stupid animal. You make a mistake. The ass is not a stupid animal. It is the same as if you were thinking of Mr. So-and-so with whom you have to do, and you think, of course, he is an ass. He is not an ass, necessarily. Or you think of him, he is a liar. He is not necessarily a liar. And if you think he is a liar and treat him as such, then you are the stupid ass and make a bad mistake because you cannot deal with him. And so when you think the wrong thing about anything, you are the idiot that turns something perfectly all right into a nonsense, into your projection. That same thing can be done with the body. For instance, there are plenty of people who, it is certainly discovered that they neglect their body. And that is naturally based upon a certain resistance against the body, or of even a philosophical or religious bias concerning the body. And then I interfere. I say, now, look here, you cannot neglect yourself like that. That shows that you have foolish resistances. And later on they will say they were ever so grateful to me that I mentioned this thing, because I kept it under the hat. Stefan Georg, he was such a fellow when he came to the hospital in Paul. He was just lousy with dirt. Incredible. Or Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, that was murdered. He was running with eczema all over the body. Terribly dirty and neglected. That is, of course, a useless prejudice, and it is against instinct. Even here, one simply must have the right instinct. Of course, that's easily said, but most difficult to do. But as you feel with a patient, you get a certain notion, now that fellow goes wrong somewhere. So you can apply the same technique to yourself and realize that you eat too much or eat too little, or that you eat the wrong thing, that you are constipated and such things. It is pathological when people simply neglect themselves in that respect. Part of a neurosis. Or, very often, the outcome of historical bias. Of course, one shouldn't be so corporeal, one should be spiritual, and then one doesn't eat, or develops an ulcer, and then it is much better. Have you got anything to ask about it? I must say, I see here no problem. Why shouldn't we admire the beauty of the body? Because it can be very beautiful. Now, here is a question of Mr. Stein. How can we, who through your works and your spirit have found a way back to ourselves and the source, find a vessel to receive it in the outer collective? Must we resort to the use of traditional rituals and hope that the living God will once more make them alive? Or are we destined to wait until there are new bottles, no, skins really, to contain the new wine? If so, what happens in the meantime? The individual cannot hold too much of the spirit without losing consciousness. And finally I ask, can the individual really maintain a relationship to the self if there are no traditional rituals which enable him to return from his night sea journey? Well, I must say, somebody who lives in the present time and has a certain psychological understanding is threatened by nothing else as much as by rituals, because it takes the right back into the past, and he hasn't understood. For instance, how can we assume that a living God needs a church if he cannot manifest without a church? That thing is very suspect. Such a God would mean damn little to me. You see, it's not a question to find a vessel. We are the vessel. We are the instrument. And if we don't function as such, then we have no spirit. Because the experience of a man with spirit is that he is made to function. That makes him tick, and he doesn't question whether there is a collective form in which he could express himself. That means he needs crutches, he cannot function, he needs a ritual. You see, if the spirit wants a ritual, you will do it. If it does not want a ritual, no ritual on earth can replace the spirit. There is no substitute for the spirit. And somebody who seeks a ritual, well, that's simply a declaration that he cannot function without being contained. That is like a child who says, I can't walk unless the mother holds me. Well, that is not a proper function. That is a paralysis. The traditional ritual helped us to remain in contact with the self as we understand it. It helps you to remain in contact with an idea, a symbolic idea, that we declare to have been an idea of the self. For instance, we say that Christ, in a certain way, is the idea of the Homo Maximus, of the Anthropos, of the Filius Hominis. That is a symbol of the self. But inasmuch as we have the idea that Christ really means the self, that very same ritual becomes the worst temptation to lose your relation to the self. For instance, if you are a bit sensitive and you go to a beautiful mass, you go into that beautiful ritual and you forget yourself. You're dissolved into that beautiful form, but it doesn't help you to keep any relation to yourself. To keep to the self is an intimate individual experience, and it is an intimate individual activity, an effort, where anything, even if it is something very spiritual, will be a mere hindrance that hinders you to understand or to become aware of your relatedness to the self. The self is, in that respect, a very small, a tiny, and a very tender thing that cannot be disturbed by outside influences. So you see, a man who is alone by himself, and has no church and no holy water and no communion, would be quite lost. Such a one has no relation to the self. The relation to the self is in the first place a lonely experience. And only inasmuch as you find understanding or people with similar experience, you are not isolated. But it doesn't help you to go to church or to follow certain rituals to get that feeling, because you won't get it. I once an old Catholic peasant say to me, Doctor, you know so many things. I would like you would explain to me once why do we Catholics not keep together? I said, but don't you keep together? I said, oh no, we don't keep together. The Protestants, they are far more interested in each other. He gave me examples in a very naive way. And then I saw what he meant. Namely, he meant something quite intelligent. The Protestant has no ritual, practically. He has no community in a form. If there is community, it's all human and often quite rational. But in Catholicism, it's quite different. You have a church, you are a member of the church, you are in the church, and that is your relationship to other people. You don't need to take care of it. Just go through Protestant villages. There, the dung heaps are neatly folded and are quite a sight. In Catholic villages, very often the dung heap isn't nice. It's rather in a bad and anesthetic state. You can see these things because one cares less what other people think. The Protestant is far more concerned with his neighbors. A parson here in Zürich told me an interesting story. He had 7 children from a shoemaker who was a Czechoslovak and Catholic, and all came to him to be confirmed. He got interested and went to that man and asked him, I know you and your wife are Catholic, why do you send me your children? He said, well, I know it's very peculiar, but I think it's better for them. They learn more about social connections, friendships, than when they are Catholic. Because in a way we get too easily off with confession. It takes the sting out of things, and then why go any further? Why make an effort? That is a very serious thing. For instance, I had a colleague, he was a professor, a thin man, like myself, and he once asked me, now say, what would you call a neurosis? Of course, I was careful not to say, why in hell do you know it? I explained it to him carefully, what a neurosis is. He thought a while, then he said, well, if that is so, that about 2/3 of my clientele is neurotic. I said, very likely so. Then he said, I don't see why you are so interested in psychology and why you take such immense trouble to understand these things. You see, when I am in a trouble or if I have a problem, I ask my father confessor, and perhaps he doesn't know a solution, then he asks the bishop. And if the bishop has no solution, he writes to Rome, and there since 2000 years the most intelligent people are sitting together and have worked out these problems long ago. Why are you interested in the human mind? It is all done, and this is now a form, you know, this Roma locuta causa finita. That is ritual. That is ritual life for you. Now, such a man, you see, he hasn't even an interest. He sees nothing. He's completely blind. If fate had thrown me together with him, and it would have been, he's quite a nice fellow, and it should have been a friend of his, I would have been a white elephant to him forever. He would have understood nothing at all, and I would have handled him like a sack full of potatoes, because such a man means nothing to me whatever. That is a serious handicap. When you live in a ceremonial way or in a ritualistic way, the vessel grasps for you, you don't grasp. There is, for instance, a question of Dr. Spiegelman about the symbol and its distinction from the sign. Now that is a theme, you know, probably we are well informed about, and it can be found practically everywhere. And, that's the elementary thing which doesn't need a special answer. On the other side, there is the question whether a main symbol that shapes your life is necessarily unconscious. That is not the case, not at all. It is not necessarily unconscious. It can be highly conscious. For instance, think of the Christian symbol or any other. The bringing up to consciousness of an unconscious symbol doesn't settle that symbol or empty it of its contents. On the contrary, it can stay on, of course, as long as it doesn't age. That means as long as it expresses the underlying constellation. When that changes in the course of time, perhaps in the course of a long time, then it ages, and then it doesn't express anymore, either totally or partially. Now, the ideas of synchronicity has nothing to do with projection, with psychological projection. Those two concepts are incommensurable. Now, you see, that leads us to questions that we are coming to now. Namely, the question, what is man to do with his passionate, primitive, chthonic animal nature? The chthonic passions have, in the Occidental world, become identified with evil, and the spiritual passions with good. Instead of denying them or transcending them, the psychologists may answer that we must accept the dark instinctual forces. We must incorporate them and stop projecting them. But what does acceptance mean, and how does it make it less destructive? This is a serious question, you know, and a very decisive question. A question most frequently completely misunderstood. There is no question whether this thing could be accepted or not. It cannot be accepted. That is just a trouble. It cannot be accepted. I mean, if you think of a very bad case of that sort, it's an impossible case. But if you analyze a case long enough and honestly and intelligently, you will come to this problem. You will come to the impossible problem. That is such a rule that I say you cannot analyze somebody unless you come to an impossible problem. Maybe a problem that has no issue. The classical case is one has repressed a lot of one's instinctual nature, and in analysis, of course, anybody can see how it dwells up. Now we have it on the desk before us, and now what are we going to do about it? As if we were going to do about it. Nobody can deal with it. Nobody knows how to deal with it. We are absolutely lost with that problem. That must be realized, first of all. Of course, the analyst says, now what do you do about it? I say, Madam, I'm sorry, I do nothing about it. I am not concerned with your damn instinctual nature. That is your business. I should say the same to a man. I don't know. I have no prescription. What shall it be in your case? Nobody can say that. Nobody knows. Of course, the analyst, for reasons of prestige, he feels as if he should say, now, you know, that's all eyewash. Oh, well, I have to be sublimated. Nobody knows how to sublimate such a thing. That's nonsense also. Now, what I say to such a person, that is, go to bed now. Think of all the things you are concerned with. The unanswerable question. And see what you dream. I have no answer. Nobody has an answer. So, you see how your own nature, or the unconscious, or God knows what, how that reacts. Now, of course, that is the underlying assumption of the Indians, that the great old man will speak. The 2 million old man will speak. That is a vital situation. It is an impasse. You are in a cul-de-sac. And then only you hear the voice. And it speaks in the dream. And that is the reason why we got to understand dreams. Otherwise we never get out of this impasse. Now you see, I piled a mountain of symbolism, and everybody swears about it. People think I want to prove my theory by finding out that symbolism. This is an awful mistake. You see, I have amassed such information in order to give the analyst a chance to know about symbolism, so that he can interpret the dreams. He must be able to interpret dreams, because the dreams only can answer properly. Nobody else. That is just the problem we can never answer. What to do with this damn chthonic nature of man. The only answer is the unconscious, and then of course we say, oh, the unconscious, what should it do? What should come from there? As if we knew nature, as if we knew anything about the psyche. It's simply a damn hybris, we know nothing. But you see, the 2 million-year-old man, he may know something. And mind you, that is not an exaggeration. Perhaps he has some millions more or less. But there is a thing like nature. There is a thing like an instinctual man. If you want to know him, go to the primitives. Look at them, talk to them. Then you will see it at work. Yeah, I have no difficulties to talk to primitives. I can understand myself with them very well, very easily. When I talk of the great man or anything equivalent, they understand. They know that they are up against powers. We think we are on top, but that is nothing but the hybris of the city dweller. Even a peasant knows it, that he's up against powers. But we, living in the cities, think there are no powers. The police, yes, or the communists, or Russia, or something like that. Otherwise, he's always high. Look at this poor sap, this man. He's very, of course, had great merits to have written this book. But he thinks the great man must be the ego. An absolute contradiction to what the Indians tell him. There is the great man in us, and that is the unconscious, what he called the unconscious. It is something that reacts because we have dreams under such conditions. And then it's up to the analyst to look at such a dream and help the patient to understand that dream. And therefore he needs the knowledge in order to be able to interpret what the unconscious says. And he must have a courage above all. He must have the courage to believe in his own interpretation for the sake of the patient. Even if he's not quite sure, he must be able to give credit to his own interpretation. That's very difficult when one has a critical mind. One has no end of intellectual objection against it. But you see, it is a matter of immediate help. That is just so as if a man were bleeding to death, and you stand there and deliberate which would be the best method of stopping that artery. That Professor so-and-so says one is doing it this way, and another one says no, do it this way. Well, in the meantime, man simply pops off. And that is so in practice. You see, I often was in the situation where I have to say, for God's sake, I don't know, but it seems to me it is just like that, and stand for it. You can ask yourself in a few seconds, is this really the best you could say? And when you come to a conclusion, is by God the best I can say in this case. Even if I must acknowledge that somebody else might say something better. But there's no time. Something must be done now. Mind you, if it is an error, the unconscious will correct it. But nobody believes that the unconscious can correct it. Nobody thinks that's far. Nobody thinks that the unconscious could say something which is substantially important. Yes, one might assume, oh yes, it has to do with your difficulty and so on, but in the long run, what should the unconscious? You must know that the process of individuation, namely that urge to become what one is invincibly strong. You always can count on it. And you can be sure that the unconscious, if you are not interested in your own fate, the unconscious is. And that is helpful, you see. There you have a great help. And but this is difficult. It is very difficult. It is an act of courage on the side of the analyst as well as on the side of the patient. You see, for the patient, can I trust that fellow? Can I trust myself? And he thinks, can I trust my patient? Or trust my knowledge? Or perhaps, my interpretation is all wrong. He only must be sure that he is the best he can do, and he must be the best he can do, mind you. There is no cheating, because that spoils the case from the beginning. You cannot cheat yourself when you know that you have done it in a flippant and routine way. Then you know that the devil is after you. It's the highways of the intellect you get nowhere at all. So, you got to accept what the unconscious produces, and it is up to you that you understand its language. It is the language of nature. It is not your language. It is the logics of nature, the intelligence of nature, and the morality of nature. That has to be translated into human forms. A formidable task. But that, you see, is the reason for the dignity of man. He makes sense in creation, because there is no reflection in creation. But in man is the one who has reflection. And that is his task. And if he fulfills that task, then he can live, and he can live properly. And he is not sterilized. But when he puts himself above it, he's sterilized. Stupid. It is incommensurable with science. It is even the basis of science, you see. Which scientist will observe a process in nature and assume it doesn't exist? Or it is nothing but this or that. That's all prejudice, you see. He observes what there is. And if you observe the facts that are happening in you, in reality, then you are sufficiently scientific. That is the basis of science. Now, there is another question. Is not the human bond a central and vital link in analysis? I'm referring to the bond between analysand and analyst. Now, I always held that the analyst is a human being, belonging to the species Homo sapiens. And so, I think a patient who thinks that his analyst is a transcendent monster and not a human thing is just a fool. But when the analyst assumes, he himself assumes that he is transcendent and a sort of, I don't know what, a ghost or an abstraction, then he is the greater fool. nobody gets out from under this fact that he's human, and he shouldn't be ashamed of it. That is our status. We are human. And so when I talk to another human being and I'm not human, that I'm abstract somewhere, well then I assume the role of God or I don't know what. Or I think the other is a mere thought. And that is also not true. So you see, if circumstances are true and natural, the analyst is a human being and the analysant is a human being. And there, Auseinandersetzung, that means the situation of the dialogue, consists of two parts, that means of two human personalities. That is just so. Whether the one is lying on a couch and covered up to the neck, and the other sitting behind him, enveloped in clouds of cigar smoke. Both are belonging to the human species. One as well as the other can be absolutely dead sure from the beginning that each thinks on the principle the same. You see, when the patient thinks he's a nice man, then the analyst probably thinks, isn't she a nice woman? You see, or something like that. If the patient thinks he's a disagreeable phobia, well then probably he's a old damn old cat or something like that. So that is the basis. You see, a natural man, a sound man, starts from a natural basis, and then having an objective situation, is absolutely out of the question. That's perfectly ridiculous. It's quite impossible. Can any analyst in his good senses assume that when he thinks something evil about his patient, or when the patient is disgusting to him, that the patient doesn't feel it? Of course the patient smells it. And vice versa. The thing you are is so far more stronger than your feeble words. The patient is permeated by what you are, not by what you talk. He doesn't even listen to what you talk. You see, patients listen astonishingly little, and analysts all the more. But all the more they are permeated by the real being of the patient. And because they are analysts, they cannot admit it, usually because the analyst is an abstraction in the fourth heaven or something like that. It's all ridiculous. Childish, think it's childish. It is much better you have a conscious conception of what you feel or what your inner thoughts are than that you listen. I had a patient who told me a continuous story with the greatest intensity, and she talked so much, it was of course an anonymous story, that for a moment I fell asleep. And then I said to her, did you notice? And she said, no, what? I said, well, I just fell asleep. Oh, did you? I wanted to say, non arrivé, whether I am asleep or not, she has Now you see, when people are natural, then they have a lot of information about other people, right away. It simplifies matters considerably, but it complicates matters in as much as each has unsolved problems. The analyst has certain unsolved problems because he is alive. He goes on living, and so he must have unsolved problems. Otherwise he's dead. Life is a problem every day. And so we are never finished until we are really finished. So you see, it is quite possible that one of those problems is touched upon it comes into the play, and most probably it does, and that explains, for instance, those cases, very frequent, but I would say it is the rule, that certain analysts get certain patients which form the particular emplastrum which they need. They get just that case which puts them up against themselves. Even if a case is not just likely to arouse a certain complex of the analyst, and which myself, of course, sure, of the shortest time, each puts his foot into it. That must be so. You see, that is underlying human contact. And if you take it the right way, it is the most powerful means of analysis. But when you take it the wrong way, then it stops analysis. It blows up everything that has been constructed. So the analyst is bound to know about his own complexes, and he should be afraid of them, and should be able to admit that this is his prejudice, and also when the patient gets to it. So you see, from a certain degree on, I mean, when the patient has reached a reasonable amount of insight and a reasonable cooperation, then I do not hesitate to tell my patient, inform my patient when I dream of him. Because when I dream of him, he is problematic. He has touched upon something in myself where I am not the master. I am not on top of my own questions. I am under them. And so, you see, it may be that when I tell that story to the patient, yes, that's it. I have dreamt so and so, and he brings me a dream that elucidates my own problem. That means we have reached now a place where I might be profiting from that analysis, helped in my own problem, as I help the other. I call it paternoster work. You know what that is, a paternoster work? In the old mines, where they had no lifts yet, they had long ladders that moved over in this way. So you stepped on the one, and then when the other ladder came up, you stepped up on that, and then you stepped up on the other one. And so you got up very quickly on those two ladders that simply moved like this. That is a paternoster work. And so you see, one step ahead, the patient can be a step ahead for the others too. Because that is human intercourse. You cannot be with somebody without being completely permeated by that other person. But you don't notice it, you don't know it. But you will talk things that belongs into another psychology, not yours. And a certain atmosphere will take hold of you and will increase or decrease your own prejudices. And so when you analyze a patient for any length of time, something of that kind will occur. And then you must be wise. Then you must know where you are, and you have to share certain, perhaps very private opinions and judgments and moods, etc. When the patient says, "Oh, doctor, that's too bad, you are in a bad mood today." They say, "Oh, not at all, not at all." Because you weren't able to acknowledge your own condition. That's a point against you. As is a point against the patient who is fairly advanced. "How is it with you today? You look funny." "Oh, I'm funny at all. I'm perfectly normal." How come? That doesn't carry water, you know. And then out comes the story. That should be said, particularly important with feeling types. As feeling types, you have to inquire every day. Now, what about the weather practically? How is it that you feel? How do I appear to you? What kind of feeling have you about me? what the other things you are curious about. In order to keep abreast, because you see, the feeling type, for instance, is for an intellectual a sword fight, because he touches in time and again on his own deficiencies, because he's unaware of his feelings, and so he doesn't realize what his feelings are, while the other is, of course, all the time au courant, and looks him into the cards, and that is not profitable, not at all. That is so with all the forms of inferiorities or inferior functions, Then, does not the stress on transference analysis obviate the possibility of the analyst functioning in the capacities of a shaman or medicine man or psychopompos? I hope he's hindered as much as possible. That is exactly why one has transference analysis. I mean, transference analysis, meaning the business of transference understood as a sort of projection that is hindering the clear understanding of the situation. Now, one of the greatest hindrances to a clear understanding is the projection of the shaman, of the psychopompos, of the medicine man, the miracle doctor, of the great spirit, I don't know what, the savior. As soon as you are elevated to such a rank, you are made powerless, because then the patient, of course, naturally, and when the analyst is a fool, then he's completely blindfolded, and he's lost in a sea of mist. So whenever signs appear of such a archetypical projection, then that is a warning, then at once, for heaven's sake, do you think I'm a shaman or something like that? That must be discouraged as soon as possible, because it's an archetype, and then the archetype rules the whole situation. The analyst is in the role of the archetype. He is then practically shaman, and then he is just as unable to work miracles as a shaman in the rule is. He's absolutely hindered, and every progress of life is obviated completely. But when that thing is analyzed, the father complex, that is at the bottom of it, that raises the analyst to the role of a demigod. Of course, that must be analyzed. Of course, that must be reduced to human size. But there is still the human being. That is not the whole of transference. That would be simple, You could give it to the patient in the form of a printed form, and you sign that form. I declare I am no shaman, I am not God, I am not Christ, I am no Savior, I am not this nor that. And I hand it to the patient, he countersigns it, and then the operation is finished. But, the transference is a living thing. It may appear in the form of a father transference, of Christ transference, or anything of the sort. And that is a mistake. It is a deviation which is not proceeding or produced by the bad will of the patient, but by his perplexity. He doesn't know what that other fellow is. Is he perhaps Jesus Christ, or is he the Buddha, or is he a shaman, or something like that? It's an unhappy word he uses for lack of the right word. He doesn't know what there is on the other side. If he were an Ascopy, he would say, oh, I know, that's his great man, or her great man. Then he would have the formula. Now I see, he is the great man. And have I not such a great man also? Is this perhaps a business between two great men? Not between Mr. So-and-so and Mr. So-and-so, or with so-and-so. The copy would have a great advantage. That is a mountain of work until people can see that. And how many of the analysts of today understand it? Very few, I tell you. But that is the point in analysis, you see, that first it seems to be, he's the good papa, or the bad papa, and then he's this and that and so on, a whole series of things. All those are attempts at qualifying the riddle, to see the enigma, and it is vital to the patient that he finds out about it. Because if he doesn't find out it with the analyst, he cannot find out himself. Because there is nobody else that would listen to him. So it must be the analyst, and the analyst must be able to answer these questions so that the patient can see what he or she is. You see, unless you can compare yourself with something, you cannot say, I am this and not that. So he must be able to say, I am this, but he only can say that when he knows what the that is. And therefore, that is the purpose of this form of transference. Then, let us assume we have come to the end of these perplexities, and there is still the question of transference. Still the same thing. And it has no name. This must be quite personal. And that is awkward, because both know it isn't. If they are honest, it isn't. It is something else. Everyone who is convinced that there is a consciousness, there is such a thing as archetypes, well, he is to be congratulated, because he knows what it is. He knows, here is an archetype in the play, and it is the great man, or whatever he calls the thing behind the scenes. And then he discovers that transference at bottom is by no means a personal fantasy that has to be reduced. You only lose an enormous value when you sit to personality, to individual personality. Namely, you use the connection with the collective unconscious, with the real source of life. So if you are wise, you must teach your patient about the double possibilities man has, namely to be entirely personal, which is in no way different from an animal, or that he assumes that there is something more than human personality, namely the great man or something of the sort, which is the prerogative of man. Then he can see the situation in other light. You only arrive at this insight by dream analysis and by the understanding of symbolism. That's the difficulty of it. There is only one question more, and that is about the very practical question of